Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. In this video, we'll be discussing about a new vulnerability in Swagger UI which is causing an XSS and can potentially lead to credentials harvesting. So because of this particular library which is vulnerable up to 1.0.3, this vulnerability is arising in the Swagger UI. So let's see how we can exploit this vulnerability and dig deep into this issue. So what is in Swagger UI? A Swagger UI is basically an API documentation which helps developers to document all the API calls, how it can be used, what are the parameters it requires, which method it can be used on, and all of this can be organized in a really good structured manner which helps an organization to analyze the API documentation. You can read more about the Swagger on this reference link here. So as an hacker perspective, how do we actually detect whether a host is running a Swagger UI or not? So for this, you can use a really popular tool from Project Discovery, Nuclei, which has they have already created a template for this to detect in Swagger UI. So you can use this template, HTTP exposures API swagger-api.yaml file, which detects an Swagger API or Swagger UI running on any host. You may have to run FFUF before before running on this Nuclei template, because for that you'll have to know that on which API endpoint the Swagger is running. So many times it does not run on default endpoints, so you'll have to first something like API docs, API-docs, or API or maybe docs, right? So these are some of the word lists which you can use to first that API endpoint, and then you can detect the Swagger. This is also really cool in terms of automation perspective. So if you have a lot of hosts where you want to detect which hosts are running Swagger, you can simply use Nuclei with this template, and it will give you all those hosts which can be detected from the public endpoint, and it can be like maybe running Swagger UI. So this is the link for that template. You can check how it is detecting. So it's probably detecting on the basis of keywords on the response body like Swagger UI. So it can give false positive, but yeah, it's a really cool template and you must use it for detecting the Swagger UI. So what is CVE 2025-8191? It is basically affecting not the latest versions of Swagger UI. So it's not an alarming vulnerability, but yeah, if you're using specifically these versions from 3.14.1 to 3.37.2, which suffers in DOM cross-site scripting vulnerability due to an outdated DOM Purify embedded library. You can read about this CV more in detail using this reference link. Also, you can navigate their GitHub advisory database and read about the vulnerability in more detail. So let's see the exploitation part. Swagger UI actually offers a way to render any API documentation from OpenAPI or OpenAPI JSON file, where you can simply supply the URL in this config URL or maybe URL parameter, which will basically render all the API documentation from that OpenAPI JSON file into the Swagger UI. The structure of this config URL looks something like this, which carries the JSON or YAML file, and where it will directly render all the API functions, all the API requests, all the calls into the Swagger UI. The problem arises when this URL is blindly being trusted into the Swagger UI and it is being rendered without even checking that it is containing any HTML characters or any JavaScript functions. And this is the reason why it is executing an XSS. So let's see in detail how we can exploit it. So usually when you open a Swagger UI documentation page, you will see an index.html file where you will see all these API calls with respective methods, parameters. You can even try to hit these API calls, but obviously it will require authentication. So a lot of time you will see an admin panel here where you'll be asked to enter username or password, which basically authenticates all of these API call based on the permission. But the thing is that if you are trying to hit this URL within parameter, as I told you earlier, is config or config URL or maybe URL, you can directly render all the API calls from that particular JSON or YAML file. But if we try something like this, which has an XSS payload, so in this this is a GitHub repository which you can see and check out what's the payload. And you can simply use this config parameter with this attacker controlled JSON file hosted on your server or anywhere, and you will see that XSS will be executed. So let's see how this JSON file has been created. So you'll see this same structure which I earlier shown you in the previous slide. This is carrying a YAML file which has basically all the API documentation. So let's see how this YAML file you can create your own. So you see there is form which has an alert which is alerting a text area. So that's a simple basic API call which you can structure in a YAML file and then pass it with the config parameter. So let's see what else we can do with this XSS, how we can leverage it to maybe account takeover. So for that, you can use this particular GitHub repository, which is basically a form, HTML form with a post request on a login endpoint, but this should be an attacker control host. So here we have shown example.com. You'll simply ask username and password and then submit button with a login button, right? Now you'll ask that why any person will simply go onto this panel and enter the credential. Actually, this is a basic feature of Swagger UI, where I earlier told you that if you want to authenticate all of the API endpoints, you can simply enter the login credentials over there and it will authenticate all the endpoints, and you can simply fetch all the data, whatever coming into the API endpoints. So you can navigate to this GitHub repository and check out this payload. Now let's use this payload and see how it works actually. So as soon as you enter this URL into the config parameter, you will see a fake login page. So this is intentionally shown a fake login page to demonstrate the vulnerability, but instead you can simply use something like admin login or user login, and then once you will send this URL to the victim, they'll simply authenticate. They'll simply try to authenticate the API endpoint and enter valid credentials. And once they enter a valid credential, you can simply check out your logs where you will see that the user has entered the credentials, and now you can authenticate all the endpoints. So how do we fix this issue? Swagger UI currently running latest version, which is 5.29.3. So you can simply upgrade into any stable or latest version which is free from any known vulnerability. Upon research, we have seen that Swagger UI up to version 4.1.3 are vulnerable with some of the vulnerabilities. But yeah, latest versions are free from any vulnerability, so you can directly mitigate this by upgrading your Swagger UI. So thank you for staying with me and see you in the next video.